This is day number 2, Senator, for our students here on campus. You can tell because there's no parking. You all notice that. So we love having those students here. Day number 2, and we will have had within 2 days both of our senators. And we are so lucky to have Senator Mike Lee here with us today. He's been a good friend of the Hinckley Institute. We're glad to have you here with us today. For those of you, we'd love to have you stay after we hear from the good senator. We'll have a panel discussion here to talk about some of the issues that will have been discussed. And as always, we have Rick Larson, our partnership with the Sutherland Institute. We are so grateful for to have you here today to have this critical conversation with our great senator here. Senator Mike Lee, thank you for being with us. Let's give a hand for Senator Mike Lee.
I'm going to state 2 things. I'll be checking my watch, not because I have other things to do, but we want to get you out of here on time. And I want to give you a few minutes before we get into some Q&A to set the table a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Fantastic. We're going to talk today about one of my favorite topics. It deals with the delegation of lawmaking power. Over the last 80 years, Congress, and by Congress, I mean broadly, Houses of Representatives, Senates, and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination, have gradually been delegating out the lawmaking power that the Constitution gives to one branch, to the Congress of the United States. When our founding fathers put together our system of government, they made Congress the most dangerous branch. And we know that for a number of reasons, not just because of their commentary, but because of what they put into the Constitution. They knew that the power to make law is inherently dangerous and therefore made Congress the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. Every member of the House is up for re-election every 2 years. 1/3 of the members of the Senate are up for re-election every 2 years. And this is because the power to make law can be used abusively, and they always wanted to make sure it was close to the people. Generally speaking, this was followed. The very first operative provision of the Constitution, the first clause of the first section of the first article, Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 then makes the point clearly by saying if you want to make a federal law, you must follow the Article 1, Section 7 formula, which is you have to have Congress act by the House of Representatives and the Senate enacting the same language, presenting the president for signature, veto, or acquiescence. Over the last 80 years or so, Congress has gotten by. Again, it's a problem of bipartisan creation with passing what sometimes amount to platitudes, broad aspirational statements, and then delegating the lawmaking power over to an executive branch department or agency. It often reads something like, we shall have good law in area X, and we hereby delegate to commission, department, or agency Y the power to promulgate rules that then have the force of generally applicable federal law. This is an interesting phenomenon that can be observed graphically. I keep 2 stacks of documents in my office in Washington, one short stack and one tall stack. The short stack is usually a few hundred to a few thousand pages long for a particular year, and it consists of the laws passed by Congress in the last year. The other stack is often 13 feet tall, can be as long as 100,000 pages, and it consists of last year's Federal Register. For those of you who are fortunate enough not to know what the Federal Register is, it's the annual cumulative index of federal regulations as they're promulgated by executive branch agencies. Promulgated meaning released to the public initially for notice and comment, saying, these are the laws that are about to govern you, let us know what you think. And then they circulate them again after they've been finalized following the notice and comment process. 100,000 pages. The American people are bound in countless instances by what's in those 100,000 pages. But the difference is the people who write those 100,000 pages don't work for you. You don't ever get a chance to vote for or against them. And that's a problem that I want to talk about today.
Fantastic. I love the grounding in the Constitution. I want to start there because I've been looking at some analysis of the REINS Act. We're going to talk specifically about that piece of legislation because I think there's a directional signal within that that's important. So when most people criticize Congress today, they say it's dysfunctional and they've abdicated their authority to the executive branch. Everything's done by executive order. Congress isn't functioning. Describe the REINS Act in that context, because I see a move towards accountability.
Yes. The REINS Act is a legislative proposal that aims to address the very problem that I've just described. It's a bill, and it stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. And what it says, in essence, is that for every new major rule regulation, that is, a regulation that imposes affirmative legal obligations on the public, not to be confused with an internal regulation determining, let's say, what time the lights go on and off in the State Department or the Department of Commerce, and that is deemed economically significant by the Office of Management and Budget, would not be self-executing. It couldn't take effect without Congress affirmatively enacting it into law. In other words, it's a means by which new major rule federal regulations would be treated as legislative proposals to be considered on a fast-track basis by Congress. It couldn't take effect without being enacted affirmatively into law. The REINS Act isn't a complete cure. It's not a complete fix to the excessive delegation of lawmaking power, but it is as close, as nearly perfect a fix as I have found, and I think would fix the overwhelming share of the problem. And what we're trying to fix, again, is the detachment from the American people of the authority to make law. James Madison, as if anticipating our day or fearing that we might see something like this, commented in ways that were eerily prescient at the time in the late 1700s. In Federalist 62, he said words to the effect of, paraphrasing slightly, words to the effect that it'll be of little avail to the American people that their laws are written by men and women of their own choosing, if those laws be so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that they can't be read and understood by those subject to them. Because a law is a rule of action. You can't know what you're expected to do or not do unless there's some mechanism by which you can know that. So this is about accountability, and it's about liberty in the purest sense. What it means to live in a free country, what it means to live in a system in which your government operates pursuant to democratic principles means that those who make your laws should be elected and accountable through an election.
Let's put it in context for those who have not affected their minds by a deep dive into political science, as some of us have. We all remember, at least some of a certain age, we remember the great little television ditty about how a bill becomes law. Some of us can still hum the tune. But let's talk a little bit about legislative intent and why this is so important. And for a context, so versions of the REINS Act, as far as I could tell, have been thrown around since 2009, 2010, and it's finally progressed to this point. We have legislation on the books that has to do with things like immigration, the environment. Let's talk about legislative intent years and years ago and what happens administratively now to what on its face seems a really good law before it goes into this administrative cycle.
Yeah. So when I look at legislative intent, I should clarify the caveat. I believe what matters is not subjective intention of any one lawmaker or group of lawmakers, so much as the public meaning of the words they use at the time the legislation is enacted. It can be difficult to ascertain. People can disagree as to what the original public meaning is or was at the time of the enactment of the law. But we do have tools by which we can measure these things and achieve some rough approximation of what was intended. One of the problems with excessive delegation of lawmaking power, and one of the reasons why we need the REINS Act, is that when you strip the meaning from the originating legislation in the first place, there's nothing there. It's an empty vessel. And so as an executive branch agency tries to breathe life into something by promulgating regulations that they deem consistent with the stated purpose and effect of the originating legislation, if all it says is we shall have good law in area X and agency Y has the power to make rules carrying the force of generally applicable federal law, there's nothing there. It's like when you're a kid and well, it's not exactly like this, but bear with me. You go to your mom and you ask for permission to go to your friend's house, and your mom says, go ask your dad. You ask your dad the same question, your dad sends you back to your mom. There's a choice of law, conflict of laws term for this that we use that you'll learn when you go to law school if you choose that path, called the renvoi. It's a law French term. It means to return unopened. And so the law is now full of renvois insofar as the executive branch agency folk, the people who are drafting these regulations, they don't really have a lot to go on, and so they just make it up as best they can. And I want to be clear, these executive branch bureaucrats, I don't want to send the impression that I'm referring to them derisively as, oh, these are by and large people who are well-intentioned, hardworking, highly specialized in their fields, and are doing the best job that they can. I don't actually blame them. I strongly dislike a lot of the policies they come up with. But they're not actually the problem. We are. Congress is the problem because we gave them this unbridled authority to begin with. And it manifests itself in countless ways that are difficult to anticipate. A few years ago, one of my roles in the Senate, I serve on the Judiciary Committee. And we have jurisdiction over, among other things, the federal criminal code and sentencing laws. I was involved in a long-time effort to reform our sentencing system and a very large criminal justice reform package we got passed a few years ago. Sort of in tandem with that, we were wanting to know the answer one day to the following question. How many federal criminal laws are there? How many different federal criminal offenses exist? We asked the question of the Congressional Research Service. CRS is an agency whose job it is to answer questions like that by people in Congress so they can know how best to address our lawmaking needs. The answer that came back was stunning. They said that the answer is both unknown and completely unknowable, but that there are at least 300,000 federal criminal offenses on the books. And their explanation was revealing as to why it's unknown and unknowable, but at least 300,000. They said a lot of these crimes are made not by statute, but by federal regulation issued by an executive branch agency promulgating these rules. And so when you live in an era, going back to James Madison's language, where the laws, in addition to being so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing, you can't know what they are. They're not even made by men and women of your own choosing. That's messy. And it's why I'm so passionate about the REINS Act. We need to reform this.
So there are a couple of thresholds within the REINS Act. One is that this oversight is triggered by certain budget amounts. If a decision takes expenditures over, I think it's $100 million.
Compliance costs.
Compliance costs. One is if it becomes an imposition on business, those types of things. A couple of them fascinate me. One is the call for the review of at least 20% of agency rules currently in effect. I'm wondering how that will be prioritized. Referencing the stack on your desk, the larger one, a little research showed that federal agencies have finalized over 3,500 regulations per year in each of the last 3 years. So with that depth of regulatory action, where do you begin in your review of the 20%?
It's a difficult task. It's hard to know where to begin. I believe that gives discretion to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to know where to begin that review. I'm not sure where they would start it. It would probably depend on who was the OMB director at the time and what he or she deemed the greatest priorities. There have been other versions of the REINS Act that have been introduced in the past and others that will be introduced over the next year or two. One version that I had introduced in the past had what I called a filter in it, one that would require all existing executive branch promulgated regulations carrying the force of generally applicable federal law to sunset after it was either a 5 or a 10-year period so that you could filter everything back through. As a practical matter, whether you have that in there or not, almost everything is eventually going to make it through the cycle because over time, regulations change and that triggers a process and you have to issue a new regulation to change an old one. I still will feel better once we get this version replaced with something that has some kind of a mandated filter.
Do you see a risk? It seems in the environment we live in today, virtually everything is politicized, even if it need not be. Things that we could easily consider and say what is best for humankind. Do you see a risk that certain more controversial and dated law, for instance, those issued by the EPA, could those become a stumbling block at a point where it locks up again and the review can't be completed?
In a nutshell, yes, but that's the whole point. When we use the word politics, we use it derisively and understandably. Some might say to understand the word politics, you have to break it down into its Greek roots. Poly, which means many, and ticks, which are blood-sucking parasites. You put them together, and it's not a pretty picture. So yeah, it will inject politics into this, and some of this could be controversial. That is the whole point. The Constitution itself is a political document, a democratic system of government founded on a constitutional republic like ours cannot operate without a political system. In fact, that's what differentiates government of, by, and for the people from a tyrannical regime, is a political process in which voters have input, at least on those who are making the law. And so, yes, some of that will be a stumbling block, and that is precisely the point, because the way this operates, very often a new major rule, regulation will come out, and it may have devastating consequences for an entire industry, for an entire region, for a particular state, or a particular part of one state. And again, this isn't because of people who run these agencies are bad or dumb or malicious, so much as it is that they've got a limited view and they can't see everything all at once, and they're sometimes going to get things wrong, or they're not always going to see everything. We've had circumstances, for example, where the EPA has placed limits in certain parts of the country, including parts of our state, limits for ozone at levels below where Mother Nature herself has set them, making it impossible to achieve certain types of permits in those regions. People get upset when that happens. That's the tip of the iceberg, but it's one example of just showing where they might get it wrong. But those are exactly the kinds of things that do need to be subjected to the light of day and public debate so that those things can be aired.
In keeping with your support for this and the potential of greater transparency and oversight and function of Congress, Cato, a national think tank, in a summary report on this said the primary effect of the legislation would be to make Congress more responsible for federal regulatory activity by forcing legislators, I think this is interesting, forcing legislators to voice their opinion on the desirability of significant regulatory changes. In other words, they can't hide behind a president or a public opinion poll. That's a good thing.
It's a very good thing. In fact, it's a necessary thing. It's absolutely essential to the way our system of government is supposed to operate. Very often when one of these regs comes out, and every once in a while they come out with a real doozy that really harms a lot of people. A new regulation will always have some fans, but it may have a lot of enemies as well. And a lot of people who are harmed by it will understandably, properly go to their members of Congress, their senators and their representatives, saying, please help us with this. Members of Congress are notorious in those moments for beating their chest and pounding the table saying, doggone it, which is strong language where I come from. You know what I'm going to do in response to this? I'm going to write a harshly worded letter to that agency, and I will show them a thing or two. I wrote a book in which I talked about some of this, chapters 3 and 8 of a book called The Lost Constitution I wrote a few years ago. Talked about some circumstances in which members of Congress who had voted for one of the iterations of the Clean Air Act before it resulted in regulations that proved controversial in the New York metropolitan area. Some of the same members of Congress who had voted for the legislation, campaigned aggressively on it, came out and openly protested against the EPA for promulgating regulations that they themselves had just authorized the EPA to promulgate. Again, not EPA's fault. It was their fault. They did it. The point here is to require them to make the law. Again, that is why the founders put this only in Congress, because Congress is the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, and that's necessary because we wield the most dangerous power in the federal government.
It's interesting, as I read some of the key points of the legislation, there was one inclusion that I'm going to guess wouldn't have been there in 2010. And I debated whether or not to bring this up, but I suspect that the roots of this are both constitutional and possibly commerce issues, that it calls for oversight of any increase in mandatory vaccinations. And I bring it up because morning news. Anyone who heard it, Rutgers University is again imposing all kinds of regulations on campus, distancing, masks, vaccination to live in student housing. Tell me a little bit about how that specific point made it into the sequence of this legislation.
That provision made it in before I arrived in Congress. The short answer to your question is I have no idea. I will find that out. It's a good answer. Yeah,
it's a good answer. Transparency seems to be a theme for you. If I can shift just a little bit, in July you introduced the HERO Act, Higher Education Reform and Opportunity Act, and I thought it fitting as we're sitting here on a campus to talk a little bit about your objectives for to bringing transparency to higher education.
Yeah. One of the things that we want to do, the Higher Education Reform Opportunity Act accomplishes a number of things. Among other things, we want to make sure that our higher education system in the United States is the best that it can be, and that we don't have, we're not holding it back in a bygone era. We have long assumed that to provide a quality higher education, you have to be stuck in the Carnegie unit, in the 50-minute hour and the credit hour system that everybody has learned. But there is a lot that I think can be achieved in the higher education space through things like mentorship programs, apprenticeships, massive open online courses or MOOCs. And yet all those things are taken outside the umbrella of eligibility for participation in federal higher education assistance. We think it can benefit from this. So that, coupled with mandatory reporting requirements on what people are graduating in, what their employment situation looks like years after the fact, the ability to repay any loans they've taken out, it's sort of consistent with truth in lending standards. As long as the federal government's going to be making itself the lender in this area, it ought to provide some transparency to the borrower so that they know what they're getting.
So this may just go in purely into personal opinion, but I'm interested in that. Again, because we're on campus, some of the negative attacks on higher education, they wander all over the place, from the student debt crisis to the value of certain degrees, workforce issues, participation in workforce issues. There are all kinds of layers to this. And then enter artificial intelligence. Would you say to a young audience, what is the value of a higher education? Is it more important we know how to run a certain software, or should we still invest our time in a complete education, and what value does that hold to society?
Look, as the son of a former university president, I strongly believe, in part because it was drilled into me from the time I could crawl, that there is independent value to obtaining an education. Even including and especially an education outside the field in which you might earn a living. That's why there is a lot of importance to a liberal arts education, or at least a component of your general education requirements that make sure that you get some breadth of an educational background. There are a lot of things in life that you might not do for a living, but that are nonetheless going to inform and enrich everything else you do. So I think there is and always will be a place for a traditional higher education learning environment. It's just that shouldn't be the exclusive eligible recipient of federal higher education assistance.
So I always feel compelled to state, for those who may not be familiar with Sutherland Institute, that we are a nonpartisan public policy think tank. So no questions are motivated by a political agenda. However, we're coming up on a very interesting election. I love your thoughts. You've been in the Senate for some time now. What have you seen evolving? How's the function of Congress, in your view, compared to when you first entered? With all you've learned, all you've seen, a number of things you've accomplished, where do you think it stands today in terms of functionality? And do you have concerns as you look at the election landscape in 2024?
Well, I've always got concerns. Look, one of the beauties of our system is that nothing is a sure thing in our system of government. That's good for everyone, I think. The fact that nothing is assured means that the people are in charge, and that people can change their minds, and they frequently do change their minds based on evolving conditions on the ground. As far as the condition of Congress and what I've seen in the way it's changed in the 12 years or so since I first came to the Senate, there are a couple of trends that I find disturbing, and these cross-party lines, so it's consistent with your nonpartisan theme. in both houses of Congress and in both political parties, as their members are reflected in both houses of Congress, I've seen a trend toward a consolidation of power. We've seen this generally in the federal government over the last 80 years. It's part of the phenomenon I described a moment ago. Over time, you have tended, since the New Deal era, you've tended to see people transfer of power going from the American people in two steps. First, from the people at the state and local level being transferred to Washington. Then within Washington, you've seen a lot of power transferred from the people's elected lawmakers over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who end up wielding a lot of the lawmaking power. But even within Congress, even where we are still doing our job as lawmakers and still passing laws, there is a different type of excessive consolidation of power that I also find troubling, which is that members are tending more and more to defer to and behave as if they worked for the legislative party leaders in their respective houses of Congress. I'm referring, of course, broadly to what I sometimes describe as the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, McCarthy, and Jeffries. And over time, I've seen more senators and more representatives behave as if they worked for the Republican or the Democrat in the House or the Senate, depending on which house they serve in and which party they belong to. I find that troubling because, look, parties don't agree on everything, and it doesn't reflect, in my view, it usually doesn't reflect a petulant desire to be disagreeable between the two parties. They reflect sincere disagreements among those who elected them. But there are areas where the parties are not necessarily dead set against each other. There is a lot of nuance in the law. There are a number of areas that are not necessarily staked out as either Republican or Democratic territory, and there's a lot of bleed-through. There are countless examples of this. There is an emerging war-leery segment of my own political party, and I'm part of that. I'm something of a, I don't know whether to call myself dovish, but I am not a war hawk, which makes me somewhat anomalous as a Republican. One of countless examples of where there's not a perfect mirror image, reverse symmetry between the two parties. And it's good for members to be able to explore those areas on their own to figure out what the best policy solutions are and where there are areas for potential agreement. What often thwarts that is when they start to defer to their respective party legislative leader in their respective chamber. That results in a sort of outsourced thinking. Mitch McConnell is my colleague from Kentucky. I don't work for the senator from Kentucky. I work for the people of Utah.
It's an important point, especially I think there's great value in having these conversations in a campus environment, because there has been a trend of late where these open conversations somehow are not invited in a campus environment. We've never found that to be the case in Utah, but I've certainly read about the national trends. So as we sit here with students among us, what is your outlook? The founders warned against the potential dysfunction of party politics. What is your message to a young voter? When things get a little out of whack, do we scrap the system and look at other nations and say they're doing it better than us? What is the correct response?
Well, first of all, if we were to go that direction, I would want to know what other nations are doing it better than us. Because in most circumstances, you either look at that nation's system of government and you discover that it's not quite as green on that side of the fence as you thought before the inspection, or alternatively, yes, that works for them there, but there are a number of reasons why that won't work here. I'm never one who's inclined to scrap our system of government, because I think the system works well as far as we follow it and we respect each other in doing so. It is being tried. I think it's being stretched in part because we have neglected its structure. When we think about constitutional protections, the first thing that comes to most of our minds, if you were awakened in a dead sleep and somebody said, what are constitutional rights? For most of us, the first thing that would pop out would likely be a reference to, I don't know, the First Amendment, freedom of speech and religion and so forth, or, Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial, Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, something like that, one of the thou shalt nots of the Constitution. Those are all important, and they're part of the Constitution. We need them. But they are not the only thing in the Constitution. What we're neglecting are the structural protections of the Constitution. I think those have been the most overlooked, and they're also the most consequential to overlook. Because everything else, all of the thou shalt nots in the Bill of Rights, for example, they function well only to the extent that we have in place structural protections to protect us against the dangerous accumulation of power in the hands of the few. Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer used to go around and do this sort of roadshow where they would talk about the law and they would kind of make fun of each other's style of constitutional and statutory interpretation. It was fantastic. But in some of these sessions, they would say, Justice Scalia in particular would say, any tin-horn dictator anywhere in the world can have a Bill of Rights. And in fact, most tyrannical regimes throughout the world do have bills of rights. Many of them resemble our own. Some of them even put ours to shame in terms of the breadth of the scope of protections that they provide. But he said, what differentiates one from another and what makes the difference between a place where liberty thrives and where tyranny prevails is whether you've got these structural protections to protect against the dangerous accumulation of power in the hands of the few. So look, our system is being stretched, sometimes almost at the breaking point, because of the way we've neglected the structural protections. We've assumed that everything is federal when it is not. And thus, we've forced an expectation that's unrealistic. Has been since the founding of our country. We think, we are very diverse today, but we think we're unique in our diversity today. Founders lived in a diverse republic as well. The original 13 states had a lot of differences between them, culturally and otherwise, economically, in so many different ways. Came from different backgrounds and different belief systems. So they understood then that we wouldn't be able to agree on everything nationally, and that's why it was important to keep most powers of government close to the people at the state and local level. And the reason is you allow more people to have access to more of the kind of government that people want and less of the kind of government they don't want. And that's why they limited the power they gave us at the federal level, national defense, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights and patents, bankruptcy laws, regulating trade or commerce between the states, foreign nations with the Indian tribes, granting letters of marque and reprisal and declaring war. There are a few others, but that's basically it. So we've neglected that one, inverting the pyramid. Madison described the powers of the federal government as few and defined, and those reserved to the states as numerous and indefinite. We've inverted the pyramid over the last 80 years or so. It all started on April 12, 1937, when the Supreme Court decided a case called NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. I want to come back another day and talk about that case because they changed the Constitution and that reversed the trend. And then once we brought that much power that belonged with the people at the state and local level to Washington, members of Congress choked on it. And they said, oh my gosh, we're going to be accountable all of a sudden on all these local activities. Labor, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, health, safety, welfare. They're all under our purview now. So what do? And that's why they delegated the power to executive branch agencies. So we messed up both of the twin structural protections. Federalism being vertical, separation of powers being horizontal. We distorted both of them, starting in the New Deal era, and we have been deviating further from them ever since then. My point is this, in response to your question. The system appears to be struggling because we have completely disregarded those core protections that are upstream from everything else. I think if we restore those, we'll find that it's going to function quite well. And that even the richness and the depth of our disputes as a country, they won't go away as people still disagree. People see things differently. It's just human nature. It's always going to be that case as long as we live on the earth. But we can manage it a lot better if we don't demand absolute consensus where consensus is impossible.
I want to touch on that inversion maybe as a closing statement, but one more question before we get to that. It's a great deal of conversation today about civility, about finding ways to have conversations minus this contempt for one another. So I think you would have a valuable answer because there are times when you will vote in a way that the press will grab and say, oh, he's going counter to the party, whether it's a budget ceiling or whatever it is, he's being difficult. Where is your anchor, and how does one disagree civilly without abandoning their principles?
It's a lot easier to disagree civilly if you focus on the principle rather than on the personality involved. It makes it easier not to personalize something. It's easy to get upset if you feel like somebody is attacking you personally by proposing a bad policy or a bad law. If you're focused instead on the people you're responsible for looking out for, and the fact that you took an oath to a constitution that requires certain procedures to be followed and that limits the scope of your authority to begin with, that takes down the temperature a lot. And I should add here, if I believed everything I read in the paper and everything I knew about Congress were limited to what I read in the paper or see on TV or on social media, I would probably believe that Congress was a far more barbaric, hostile, and openly contemptuous place than it actually is. Just imagine for a minute, whether you're a student or a professor or you do something else, imagine if you operated in a world in which there were reporters, TV cameras present, following you throughout your workday or your school day or whatever, and they segmented out sort of the spiciest moments of your interaction or your classmates' interaction with anybody else, and then aired those. People would probably have an impression that your life was full of a lot more contention than it actually is. It's the nature of things. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's if there are people yelling at each other, that makes for much more compelling reporting than if it's not. There's actually a lot more civility in Congress than I think meets the eye. It's gotten a little tougher of late because emotions sometimes get away with folks, and I do believe that will continue to get worse as long as we continue to put more and more into the federal government that may not necessarily belong there. It's only going to get more contentious, but it's not nearly as bad as it appears. Speaking only for myself here, a lot of my favorite people are people who I disagree with on most votes within the Senate. Some of my favorite colleagues are people who I have to struggle a little bit more to find areas where we agree. There's a great picture of me and Bernie Sanders hugging in the Washington Post a few months ago, working on a war powers issue. Those sorts of things happen, and I can't think of a single Democratic colleague I have who I don't really like.
That's important. Thank you for that. So let's wrap up with this. And I ask this a little bit selfishly because I've heard you answer similar questions before, and I think it would be valuable to the audience. So the government is the largest employer in the nation. There's been an inversion. The media does not help with the perception of civility and cooperation. There are a number of things wrong. Where do we begin to turn it back to its proper structure? Is there hope? Can we turn it back? And where do we begin as individuals?
It can be turned back because this is a government that's in the hands of its people. As George Washington was preparing to leave the presidency at the end of his second term, he's full of all these thoughts and emotions, and he talked about going on this walk through the city of Philadelphia, and he was worried about the country. It was still a new country. We're still a new country. I hope we'll always be a new country. He didn't know where things were going, and he said, I had this realization: the American system of government is in good hands because it's in the hands of the American people. And so it's one of the reasons why I focus so much on reforms like the REINS Act, because they help realize the promise of keeping the American people in charge of their own government. So literally every 2 years, not just every 4, but every 2 years, the American people have the ability to almost completely remake federal policy. The fact that they don't always make significant shifts from 1 2-year period to another doesn't mean that they can't. It just means that they haven't yet. But I do think there is a real opportunity, and it's an opportunity that I fundamentally believe exists in both political parties. Federalism and separation of powers at their core are neither Republican nor Democratic. They're neither liberal nor conservative. They are simply constitutional principles. They are process principles and structural principles. I very much look forward to the day when in both political parties, it will be seen as not only acceptable, but expected and desirable for candidates to openly campaign on areas in which they would, if elected, make themselves in the office to which they're aspiring less powerful. Because I think most of us can agree that there is too much power in Washington. This is what causes so much emotion around it. This is what causes protests and people behaving in crazy ways every time there's a presidential election, often when there is just a congressional election, is there is too much there. Let's take the temperature down. So yes, they can do it. Ultimately, they will do it. The sooner the American people make that choice, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you. Could we give Senator Lee a hand?